Let's start today with a question that might sound a little crazy. For years, people have been saying the dollar is collapsing, de-dollarization is inevitable. But what if that's not the full story? What if one day Russia suddenly turns around, distances itself from China, and goes right back to the US dollar? Are Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin really as close as they seem? Or are China and Russia just sticking together because they're both under pressure from the United States? And if that pressure disappears, do they drift apart? That's a lot of questions, and honestly, there are no clear answers. Most of what we hear these days sounds pretty similar. The dollar is doomed, the US is declining, China is about to take over the world. And now there's an even bigger narrative that China and Russia are teaming up to build a brand new financial system, one that replaces the US dollar entirely. Sounds like a historic turning point, right? Like the world is about to flip overnight. But what if reality is the opposite? What if this so called alliance trying to replace the dollar is actually proving how hard it is to replace it? Because behind all the headlines, this isn't just a story about countries teaming up against the US. It's something much more complicated. Over the past few years, it feels like the whole world has been preparing for a post-dollar future. China is building alternative systems to bypass the dollar. Russia, after sanctions, started using the yuan. BRICS expanded from 5 countries to more than 10, with many more waiting to join. On the surface, it looks like a financial revolution. The goal seems simple: push the dollar out. But here's the twist. Inside this alliance, one key player isn't getting stronger, it's getting trapped. And that situation might actually be the biggest reason the dollar isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Let's start with what we all know. The US dollar dominates almost everything: global trade, oil pricing, central bank reserves. And that gives the United States enormous power. It can sanction countries like Iran or Cuba. It can restrict access to global finance. It even removed Russia from SWIFT. That was a wake-up call. So naturally, countries like China and Russia don't want to stay dependent on the dollar forever. That's where de-dollarization comes in. The idea is simple: stop using the dollar. Build a new system. Break US financial dominance. After 2022, when Russia was heavily sanctioned, hundreds of billions in assets were frozen almost overnight. That shocked the world, because suddenly every country started thinking, could we be next? So what happened? Russia turned to China. Trade between them surged. China reduced its holdings of US debt, bought more gold, pushed for wider use of the yuan. The dollar is losing its grip, but that's only the surface. Reality is more complicated. Because if sanctions were lifted tomorrow, Russia could actually move back toward the dollar. Remember, years ago, Vladimir Putin even talked about joining NATO. And on the US side, one of Donald Trump's key strategic goals was to pull Russia away from China. Not because of Ukraine, but because a strong China-Russia partnership is a much bigger concern. Now, there's no solid evidence Russia is secretly shifting back. But one thing is clear: Russia is in a difficult position. It relies heavily on China right now. But that relationship isn't perfectly balanced. China needs Russia, but Russia needs China more. Russia's economy is much smaller, roughly comparable to a single large Chinese province. So when Russia shifts trade and reserves into yuan, it ties its economy closely to China. If China slows down, Russia feels it immediately. That's dependency. China calls it a strategic partnership. The West calls it something else entirely. Some even describe it as a yuan trap. At the same time, Western analysts constantly try to drive a wedge between them. They bring up territorial concerns, historical tensions, future risks. Because if China and Russia truly become inseparable, that's a serious challenge to the West. Now let's talk about China. A lot of people think China is actively trying to destroy the dollar, but that's not entirely true. China has said multiple times it doesn't aim to replace the US. And realistically, the yuan can't replace the dollar anytime soon. Yes, China is reducing US debt holdings, but that's risk management, not a full exit. Because China understands something critical. If the dollar collapses, China suffers too. So instead of tearing down the system, China is adjusting within it, diversifying, buying gold, slowly internationalizing the yuan. The yuan still makes up a small share of global payments and reserves. And there's a reason for that. It's tightly controlled. Money can't freely flow in and out, and without free movement, it's very hard for a currency to dominate globally. Then there's BRICS again. Some people see it as the ultimate anti-dollar alliance, but in reality, it's very loose. Different countries, different goals, different systems. Creating a shared currency like the euro? Extremely unlikely, because that would mean giving up control. And countries like India? They're not going to agree to that. Even local currency trade has problems. Countries don't necessarily want to hold each other's currencies. They're less stable, less liquid, less widely accepted. So what happens? They fall back on a third option, often the yuan. There are even strange situations where Russia sells oil to India and prefers to be paid in yuan, because holding Indian rupees isn't very useful outside India. And India doesn't export enough to Russia to balance things out. So the money just sits there, unused. That's the reality. This isn't a unified alliance. It's a group of countries with overlapping but not identical interests. So where does that leave the dollar? Still on top, for three simple reasons. First, momentum. The entire global system has been built around the dollar for decades. Second, scale. US financial markets are massive. No real competitor comes close. Third, trust. The dollar isn't perfect, but it's still more trusted than the alternatives. And here's the paradox. Every time there's a crisis, money doesn't leave the US, it flows into it. Even during conflicts in the Middle East, capital still moves toward the dollar. So the real question is, when will the dollar actually face a serious threat? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's figure it out together.